The year is AD 73. On the flat summit of a desolate mountain in the Judean desert, the air is thick with smoke, not from a hearth but from a funeral pyre. Below, the Roman ex-legion, 8,000 men strong, stand silent. For 3 years, they have been besieging this single, impossible fortress, Masada. They built a rampart of stone and earth as high as a modern 30-story building just to reach the walls. Now the battering ram has finally breached the gate. The legionaries pour through, swords drawn, expecting a final, bloody battle with the 960 Jewish rebels, the Sicarii, trapped inside. They find no one. The fortress is silent. The barracks are empty. Inside the palace, they find only bodies. 960 men, women, and children. Dead. Not by Roman swords, but by their own. Only one man wrote down what happened. The historian Josephus. He told a story of heroic defiance, of a leader who convinced his people to choose suicide over slavery, a story of victory and death. For 2,000 years, this was one of history's greatest stories of freedom, a story so powerful it would become the founding myth of a new nation. But it was a lie, or at least not the whole truth. What really happened on that mountain was darker, more complex, and more human than the legend allows. The Romans found silence, but the stones themselves, buried for 1,900 years, would eventually speak, and they tell a very different story. If you've ever felt that a good story is more important to history than the hard truth, you're in the right place. Here on AG Chronicle, we dig beneath the monuments to find the messy, forgotten reality. Every view, every subscription helps us buy one more shovel, one more satellite image to find the voices that were silenced. Now let's go back to that mountain, because the Roman ram is at the gate and 960 people are about to make an impossible choice. To understand Masada, you have to understand the year AD 70. 3 years earlier, the great Jewish revolt against Rome had begun. It ended when Roman legions, led by General Titus, sacked Jerusalem. They tore the Second Temple, the center of the Jewish world, down to its foundations. They massacred hundreds of thousands and enslaved tens of thousands more. The war was over. Rome had won. But one small, fanatical group refused to accept this. They were the Sicarii, the daggermen, religious zealots and assassins who saw any compromise with Rome as a betrayal of God. They fled Jerusalem and seized Masada, a desert fortress built by King Herod, a palace on a plateau. To Rome, this was not a military threat. It was an insult, an ember that refused to be extinguished. So they sent the ex-legion Fretensis, not to fight a battle, but to make a statement. The statement was simple. No one says no to Rome. The siege was an engineering marvel. The Romans built a wall around the entire mountain, 8 camps, thousands of men. Then they began the ramp. For months they moved millions of tons of earth, a monument of arrogance, just to get high enough to break the wall. Inside, the Sicarii could only watch. They had food. They had water in massive cisterns, but they had no hope. They were 960 people, trapped on a rock, surrounded by the greatest empire the world had ever known. The only account we have of that final night comes from one man, Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish rebel commander who had surrendered to the Romans, switched sides, and become the official historian for the Roman emperor. His loyalty was complicated. He writes that as the Romans breached the wall, the rebel leader, Eleazar ben Yair, gathered the people. He gave a fiery speech. He told them it was better to die free as a glorious sacrifice to God than to live as slaves. Better for their wives to die untouched by Roman soldiers, their children to die having never known a master. And so they made a pact. According to Josephus, the men first killed their own wives and children. Then they gathered all their possessions, set them on fire, and drew lots. 10 men were chosen to kill all the others. Then those 10 drew lots. One man was chosen to kill the other 9. And then that last man, the last survivor on the mountain, walked through the palace, ensuring everyone was dead, set the palace ablaze, and fell on his own sword. When the Romans entered, they found silence, a perfect act of martyrdom. This is the story that echoed through history, a story of ultimate defiant choice. It was so powerful that in the 20th century, the new state of Israel adopted it. Masada shall not fall again became a national slogan. But there was one problem. Josephus was in Rome. He wasn't there. He was writing for a Roman audience, trying to make sense of a barbaric act. For 1,900 years, he was the only voice, until the archaeologists came. If you believe that history is written by the victors, but the truth is buried with the dead, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to start digging. In the 1960s, a team led by Israeli archaeologist and national hero Yigael Yadin began the first great excavation of Masada. The entire nation held its breath. They were expecting to find the physical proof of Josephus's story. They were looking for the 960 heroes. They didn't find them. They found the palace. They found the storehouses. They found the Roman ramp. But the bodies were missing. They found the remains of only 28 individuals, not the 960. Where did everyone go? The Romans would not have honored their suicide pact by giving them a mass burial. So where were they? That was the first crack in the myth, and it was just the beginning. Josephus wrote that Eleazar ordered them to burn all their possessions, except their food, to show the Romans they died by choice, not from starvation. But Yadin's team found the storehouses, and they were full of unburned food. Piles of dates, olives, grain, enough to last for months. This contradicts the story. Why would they leave the food if the whole point was to make a statement? Then the archaeologists found perhaps the most famous artifacts of all. In a small area, they found 11 small pottery shards, or ostraca. Each had a name written on it. One of them bore the name Ben Yair, Eleazar Ben Yair. Yadin triumphantly declared these were the lots, the actual physical proof of the final, terrible lottery. It was a perfect discovery, too perfect. Historians now look at this with more skepticism. Were these really the lots for the final suicide? Or were they just food ration tokens, roster assignments, 11 men assigned to a work detail? Yadin was not just an archaeologist. He was a general and a politician in a new country that needed Masada to be a story of heroism. Did he find the evidence? Or did he make the evidence fit the story? The stones of Masada don't tell a story of a single heroic night. They tell a different, messier, and far more human story. The 28 bodies that were found, they weren't in a palace. They were found in a cave on the lower terrace and in the bathhouse. They hadn't been buried. They had been left to rot. The lack of 900 other skeletons suggests a grim alternative, that Josephus's all-or-nothing story was a literary invention, a noble lie. What if there was no glorious pact? What if the fortress fell not in one night, but over days? What if, when the Romans breached the wall, many did surrender? They were enslaved, and their story was erased because it wasn't heroic. What if the core group of zealots, the Sicarii, retreated to the palace, murdered their own families, and then killed themselves, while others on the mountain tried to hide? What if those lots were not for heroic suicide, but to decide who would lead the next failed raid? The story of Masada is not really about what happened in AD 73. It's about what we needed to have happened in 1960. History is not what happened. It's what we choose to remember. Josephus, writing in Rome, needed a story that showed his defeated people as noble philosophers, not just fanatical barbarians. Yigael Yadin, building a new nation, needed a story of unbreakable Jewish resolve, a story of never again. The real story, the one in the stones, is about 960 terrified, starving, and trapped people. Some were heroes, some were cowards, some were murderers, some were just mothers trying to protect their children. They weren't a myth, they were human, and their messy, complicated truth was buried under the perfect, clean lie. The Roman Empire is gone. The myth of Masada is now debated, but the mountain remains. And it reminds us that the stories we carve in stone are often the ones we are most afraid to question. Thank you for joining us on AG Chronicle. If you believe in digging for the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, subscribe. Keep the past alive, because the real stories are always the ones that were never meant to be told.